Most people who hear about the Oranje-Vrijstaat Boervolk assume they know what kind of story this is. They think this is an Afrikaner story, a white South African story, probably a right-wing one. It is none of those things. What it actually is, and what almost no one is talking about, is the story of a people who have been erased twice by completely different governments for completely different reasons, and who are now using every legal mechanism available to them because they have run out of every other option. I want to show you who the Boer people actually are, what was taken from them, what was promised in 1994, and what happened to that promise, and why a group of people standing in a field in the Free State proclaiming their independence might be the most logical thing that has happened in South Africa in 30 years. Thank you to every subscriber who supports this channel. It is always appreciated. If you are new here, I'm Riaan Roux, and this is the Riaan Roux Show. Not Afrikaners, Boers. I'm going to ask you to hold that distinction carefully for the rest of this video, because everything that follows depends on it. The Boer people are descendants of the track Boers and voortrekkers, the frontier settlers who left the Cape Colony from 1700s onwards. They moved north and east to escape British colonial control. They spoke their own dialect, not Cape Dutch, not what became standardized Afrikaans, but what they called die taal or boertaal, a dialect that developed entirely separately on the northern frontier. They built their own republics, the South African Republic, the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek in the Transvaal, the Oranje-Vrijstaat in what is now the Free State Province. These were internationally recognized sovereign states, not colonial extensions. The Oranje-Vrijstaat had treaties with Britain, with the United States, and with the Netherlands. The Afrikaner identity, the word Afrikaner in its political sense, came later, and it came from the Cape. It was a term popularized by the Cape Colony settlers in the late 1800s to describe themselves and their language. At the time, it was first used politically. The Boer people were already living in their own independent republics in the north, and had been for generations. By the end of the Anglo-Boer War, and notice the name, Anglo-Boer War, not Anglo-Afrikaner, there were identifiable distinctions within South Africa's white Afrikaans-speaking population. The Boer people of the republics, the Cape Dutch settlers, many of whom had sided with the British. These were not the same communities, and they did not share the same experience of what had just happened. The war was fought between the British Empire and the Boer republics. When it ended in 1902, the British absorbed both, but the Cape Dutch settlers, who had stayed largely loyal to Britain, were in a very different position from the Boers, who had just surrendered after watching between 26,000 and 28,000 of their women and children die in British concentration camps. These were not the same people in 1902. Their histories were separate, their political allegiances had diverged sharply, and their relationships to what came next were entirely different. But from 1910 onward, when the Union of South Africa was formed, the word Afrikaner began to swallow all of them. The Boer identity, the one that had built sovereign republics and fought and lost a war and carried a specific and distinct grievance, began to disappear into a larger Afrikaner political category. Dr. Letts Pretorius documented this process in detail. His book is not widely available. You will not find it in a PDF search or in most mainstream academic catalogues. That absence is part of what I'm describing. This is a history that was not suppressed by force. It was suppressed by being absorbed, relabeled, and quietly forgotten. The Peace of Vereniging ended the Anglo-Boer War in May 1902. The Boers who signed it were under conditions that were, by any reasonable standard, coerced. Their women and children were dying in British camps. Their farms had been burned. Their supply lines were broken. Britain's promise in return was that self-governance would be restored. 8 years later, in 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed. The Boer republics ceased to exist. The Boers became South African citizens, alongside the Cape Dutch settlers who had largely not shared their experience, and alongside British settlers who had been the enemy 8 years earlier. The Union brought a kind of peace, and for some time the Boer community accepted it. The economy was stable, life continued, and if you squinted, the old South African flag still carried the small flags of the former republics at its centre, a symbolic nod to what had existed. But the political structure of the Union, and later the Republic, declared in 1961, was controlled by a broader Afrikaner nationalist movement that included the Cape Dutch political establishment. The Boer identity was not at the centre of that project. It had been absorbed into it. This was not a violent erasure. It was a quiet one, a merger that the smaller party did not fully choose, into a larger identity that did not fully represent them. And for decades, because times were reasonably stable, that tension stayed below the surface. When South Africa negotiated its transition in 1994, the question of what would happen to Afrikaner Self-Determination was on the table. General Constant Viljoen, who led the Freedom Front, insisted on a written commitment before the election. He was close to refusing to participate altogether, and the security implications of that were significant enough that the ANC agreed to negotiate. On 23 April 1994, 4 days before the election, the Accord on Afrikaner Self-Determination was signed. The parties were the Freedom Front, the ANC, the South African Government and National Party. The document is archived by the United Nations. The Accord committed all parties to negotiate the idea of Afrikaner self-determination, including the concept of a Volkstaat, a Afrikaner homeland. A Volkstaatraad was to be established to investigate how this could be done and report back to the Constitutional Assembly. The Volkstaatraad was established. It began its work, and then it was quietly shut down. The process was never completed. The negotiations the Accord committed to were never honoured. The concept of a Volkstaat was absorbed into constitutional principle and left there, undeveloped, until it became irrelevant. Now here is what I need you to notice about that Accord. Read the document. It says Afrikaner throughout. Every reference to self-determination, every mention of a Volkstaat, every clause about who the Freedom Front represented uses the word Afrikaner. The Boer people as a distinct group are not named once. The Boer people as a distinct group with a distinct history and a distinct claim going back to the sovereign republics were not at the table. The movement that was supposed to represent them had already absorbed them into a broader Afrikaner identity. And the promise that was made and then broken was made on behalf of Afrikaners, not Boers. So in 1994, the Boer people were erased a second time. The First Erasure came from the British in 1902. This one came from the political architecture of the transition itself. The ANC has governed South Africa for more than 30 years. The record is documented. BEE policies have systematically excluded white South Africans, including Boers, from economic participation. State-owned enterprises have collapsed. Load shedding ran for years. The agricultural sector, which has always been a core part of Boer identity and livelihood, faces land expropriation pressure alongside ongoing physical danger in the form of farm attacks that remain largely unaddressed. The conditions that the Accord was supposed to protect against, the political and economic marginalization of Afrikaans-speaking communities, have materialized. The mechanism that was supposed to address them was shut down before it delivered anything. A group of people who never fully chose to be part of the South Africa that was handed to the ANC in 1994, and who were not properly represented in the negotiations that shaped that handover, have now watched 3 decades go by in a country that has made their position progressively more difficult. At what point does the expectation that they simply accept this become unreasonable? In November 2025, the Oranje-Vrijstaat Boervolk formally reproclaimed the independence of the Oranje-Vrijstaat. They have published a staatskoerant. They reference the original treaties that recognized the Oranje-Vrijstaat, the 1854 Bloemfontein Convention, the 1871 US Treaty, the 1852 Sand River Convention. I contacted them. I asked 5 hard questions about their legal foundation. They answered all 5. What I found is that they are trying to do something through a legal process. Whatever you think of their chances, they are not reaching for a weapon. They are reaching for a legal argument. They are filing documents. They are corresponding with institutions. They are building a case within the framework of international law. However imperfect that case currently is, their legal framework has gaps. I've said that, and I stand by it. But those gaps do not answer the question that actually matters. What is the alternative? If the legal process fails, if the international mechanisms do not respond, if South Africa's courts reject the argument, if no recognized authority is willing to engage with the historical claim, then what comes next for a group of people who feel they have exhausted every option? I'm raising that as an honest question, not as a provocation, because the alternative to a legal process finding traction is a pressure that builds with nowhere to go. And 30 years of South African political history suggests that nobody in a position of authority is going to address this voluntarily. South Africa's stability in the decades ahead depends on whether questions like this one get a real answer. The country cannot continue to absorb the frustrations of a community with legitimate historical grievances and no functioning political mechanism to address them. The accord signed in 1994 was supposed to be that mechanism, and it was not honoured. The Oranje-Vrijstaat Boervolk is not asking for anything that the accord did not already contemplate. They are asking for negotiations about self-determination for a people with a documented history of sovereignty. The accord said that conversation would happen. It did not. What I want to say to the Oranje-Vrijstaat Boervolk directly, and I have said this to them in writing, is that the cause is legitimate and the history is real. The grievance has standing. The legal instruments they are using need strengthening, and the gaps in the current framework will be used against them by anyone who wants to dismiss the underlying argument without engaging with it. But the underlying argument holds. A people who built sovereign republics and lost them to force, who were then absorbed into a political identity they did not choose, who watched a formal promise of self-determination get made and then abandoned, and who have spent 30 years in a country whose policies treat them as acceptable collateral damage. That is a real situation that requires a real response. South Africa has 2 choices here. Engage with this seriously. Open a formal process. Honor the spirit of the 1994 Accord that was never implemented, and create legitimate political space for this conversation, or ignore it, and the pressure becomes something harder to manage. I hope it is the former. Nothing in 30 years of South African politics gives me confidence that it will be. On 23 April 1994, the ANC, the South African government, and the Freedom Front signed a formal agreement committing to negotiate Afrikaner Self-Determination. A Volkstaatraad was established to deliver that commitment. It was shut down before the work was done. 30 years later, who is going to answer for that? Don't just know what's happening. Understand what it means. Do share this video with someone that you think needs to hear this story. And if you have subscribed, thank you, it really does help the channel. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I will catch you in the next one.